Hello and good afternoon, friends. Welcome to the CEC live lectures. Dear friends, today in this session we are going to discuss on a topic, and the topic is modern approaches in comparative politics. And for this discussion, we have once again with us in our studios Dr. Satish Kumar Jha. Dr. Satish Kumar Jha is Associate Professor in Department of Political Science at Aryabhat College, University of Delhi. Dr. Satish Kumar Jha has immense experience and he has contributed a lot in the area of academics, and his continuous services are helpful for conducting these live lectures also. Dear friends, if you want to ask questions from Dr. Satish Kumar Jha, then you can call right in the studio. You can contact us through our toll-free number. Our number is 1-800-110-430. I repeat, our number is 1-800-110-430. So let's welcome our guest, Dr. Satish Kumar Jha, and let's try to understand what are the modern approaches in comparative politics. Hello, sir. Welcome to the
Thank you, Geetika ji, and good afternoon. In fact, today's lecture we are going to devote on modern approaches in comparative politics. And when we talk of modern approaches, what we mean by modern approaches, that four different set of arguments or the schools of thought which have basically emerged in political science, particularly in area of comparative politics, and the way they have critiqued traditional approaches and traditional way of doing things in comparative politics, and through that criticism they have also offered an alternative route for carrying forward this research and study in comparative politics, and this is how this modern approach has emerged. Now, of course, this the context of this emergence of modern approach is important, which we will basically discuss briefly in course of our discussion. But what is to be remembered, that when we talk of approaches, what do we mean by approach? And here, in fact, one thing is very significant to remember, that what is approach? And approach, in fact, in comparative politics implies whole host of methods to study politics. Of course, at times a confusion happens that what is difference between method and approach. In fact, method to that extent one can say is the tool through which the approach is basically put into action. So approach is basically whole way of looking at things, how the different perspectives converge, and basically how this entire inquiry is carried forward. So therefore, what one can say, that this approach, particularly the issue of approach and method, to some extent people use coterminously, but then there are differences, because method, of course, implies or at least suggests that definitive tools, techniques, or particular way of operationalizing research, but approach is slightly more broader, has a more broader connotation, that a general way of particularly carrying research. So therefore, what we find that this modern approach, as the topic for today's discussion, has to be seen that what are the different components of modern approaches, and why this modern approach basically was considered important, particularly from the point of view of comparative politics, because we should remember that modern approach emerged as a powerful critique of the traditional approach. We will take up this issue, that what are the differences between traditional and modern. But one thing we should also remember, that one of the important reason for this need for thinking in terms of modern approach was largely on account of this expansion of the idea of political. That is, the politics, the way politics started getting expanded, and that expansion basically necessitated the requirement for new approach and new method in comparative politics. Now, when I say expansion of politics, what I mean, or expansion of idea of political, what I mean, that earlier politics was visualized or seen only through the prism of state institutions. Therefore, what was happening within the four walls of state institutions, that was considered perhaps the matter for investigation and study in politics. And therefore, what happens that in comparative politics, so far the traditional approach is concerned, most of the studies are focused on legislature, executive, judiciary, or different branches of the state, different apparatuses of a state, along with the legal constitutional framework through which these institutions operated. So therefore, that was perhaps the reference point for the traditional approach, and therefore it was called that it was a legal, constitutional or institutional approach to politics. That is basically the traditional approach. In fact, normative and descriptive were the another features of this traditional approach, because at times the norms were being discussed, or the future blueprint for politics was suggested. So therefore, on the one hand it was normative, but at times it was also descriptive, not much explanatory, description about various political systems in the world, mostly the Western advanced liberal democracies. We will refer to those studies, in fact some of the classical studies which have contributed significantly for our understanding of various institutions and various types of governments even existing in modern times, and therefore in fact as a source of inspiration for many of us in comparative politics and political science for our research and for our study. But nonetheless, these were the important features. But what happened with the expansion of the idea of political, when it started gradually scholars started realizing that it is not only the state institutions which play important role in the lives of the people, but there are other issues, there are other processes which are outside the state, but nonetheless they are equally important for understanding politics of a society. And therefore what happened, that it was realized that this entire traditional way of doing research or looking at things or explaining or describing political phenomena in fact is inadequate, and that needs and that requires some sort of modifications and advancement. And this need was felt particularly in United States of America, because of course the need was being felt elsewhere also, but United States of America, one can say that the intellectual milieu or the intellectual situation or the climate perhaps was more congenial and conducive for new sensibility or for this new mood, which resulted into a very powerful intellectual movement and which was called revolution, and that was called behavioral revolution, which we will basically discuss. Because when we talk of modern approaches, in fact essentially you imply by modern 3-4 different types of approaches which are basically used, and they emerge as a reaction to traditional. Of course, both traditional and modern, when we talk of the traditional and modern, both have the modern phenomenon, because of course what happened in ancient time, what happened later in medieval period or early modern period, which we have discussed in our earlier other lectures on comparative politics, that is basically nature, scope and so on and so forth. But in this lecture, when we are talking about traditional or modern, basically both have emerged in modern times. So there shouldn't be any confusion about it. Then why they are called traditional? Because they are traditional vis-a-vis these modern approaches which we are going to discuss, and traditional with reference to certain characteristics which were basically declared outdated by this modern scholars of this modern approach. They were basically called not suitable for the comparative politics and its research, and therefore they were called traditional. And the features I have already mentioned: normative, institutional, legal, constitutional, and essentially descriptive. So these were the features of this traditional approach. But when we talk of modern approach, what we mean by modern approach, that at least 4 or 5 different types of approaches which are basically clubbed, which are basically discussed separately, but nonetheless they are put within the category of this modern approach. One is of course the behavioral approach, about which I was telling you that it is at times referred as behavioral revolution in social science and in political science. The second is the post-behavioral revolution. Now what happened, that post-behavioralism was immediately overtaken or superseded by post-behavioral revolution in political science, and therefore that is also that also influenced this entire area or enterprise called comparative politics. Scholars started critiquing behavioral approach. They they argued that in name of behavioral studies, whatever was done was basically fruitless or basically without of any relevance. So therefore, in fact, the person who was at one point of time championing this behavioral revolution, David Easton, in political science, he himself gave that famous speech in 69, American Political Science Association, which became basically the beginning of this post-behavioral revolution. So behavioral and post-behavioral, the two approaches. So they are basically two important approaches which were used by political scientists in area of comparative politics to basically do research and do study. Now, the third approach is the system approach, which to great extent one can say was inspired and influenced by the behavioral revolution. And of course, one of the hallmark of this behavioral revolution was the focus on interdisciplinary studies, and we find that in system approach, this interdisciplinarity came in a big way. When the ideas from anthropology, sociology, psychology, economics, and various other branches of social sciences were drawn, and whole host of scholars, particularly mostly in fact the sociologists and anthropologists, be it Braun, Malinowski, Radcliffe, Braun, Malinowski, Parsons, or for that matter even Weber. So all of them, they were the precursors of this system theory, but in political science, particularly in comparative politics, this system approach was operationalized by David Easton through his political system approach, the book which he wrote and became very famous in 1950s. So therefore, the system approach. Now, a similar type of sensibility or similar type of approach was developed later on by two other scholars, Almond and Powell, and that became famous as a structural functional approach. And then, of course, we should remember that along with system and structural functional, there are many other approaches, or basically one can say that studies which were conducted in different aspects of society, culture, communication, development, and so on and so forth. And most of most of the ideas, or most the entire framework which had come out of this behavioral revolution and which had influenced the system theory, in fact we find that was taken to the study of these issues in society, culture, communication, socialization, and so on and so forth. So therefore, as a subset one can say that this modern approach diverged in different directions from system and structural functional to political culture, political development, political communication, and so on and so forth. So Carl Deuce, for example, on political communication. Similarly, Sidney Barba and and others, Lucian Pye on development, Sidney Barba on culture. So we can find that number of scholars, mostly of course located in United States of America, but they started conducting studies and research on different areas of society by operationalizing or basically using this entire tools, techniques, or basically the approach handed over by this structural functionalism or system theory influenced by the behavioralism. So therefore, this is how we find that the system theory became quite popular in area of comparative politics, and structural functionalism, of course, that was there. We'll have a more detailed discussion of system approach and structural functionalism over next two lectures today and the next part, which will be discussing all these issues in detail. But then recently what we find that a new type of approach has emerged, because we have seen that how behavioralism was overtaken by post-behavioralism. We have also taken that how post-behavioralism set a new mood in political science, when this entire issue of relevance was brought on the agenda, because it was argued that without relevance, it has no meaning. The research has no meaning. For example, in fact, what happened that this post-behavioral revolution gave an interesting slogan, because the slogan was the Credo of relevance. That how Easton's famous speech, as I was mentioning. If behavioral revolution, Easton underlined 8 important features of behavioral revolution. In fact, the same Easton also underlined 7 features of post-behavioral revolution in that Credo of relevance speech which I was referring to earlier. Now, what happened that this entire relevance aspect became quite important, because earlier it was stated during behavioral phase that it is better to be, there no point remaining vague, better to be incorrect than vague. And then later on this entire thing was questioned, that you can't be you can't say that it is better to be wrong than vague, rather in fact relevance is a very important aspect for this entire social science, and particularly for comparative politics. So therefore this behavioral post-behavioral thing followed each other. But of course the system and structural functional, as I was mentioning, as a fallout of this behavioral and post-behavioral, particularly behavioral evolution. But this new approach which has emerged recently, that is called neo-institutional approach, or it is called new institutionalism. This new institutionalism is suggestive of something which is new, though institution as a suffix is there, but nonetheless prefix is neo. So neo-institutionalism. Now we have already seen that how modern approach emerged as a criticism or as a critique of traditional approach, which had highly a fixation or fixated with this institutional studies, focused mostly on institutions. Then what way this new institutionalism is trying to offer something new? I mean, what is something new in this new institutionalism, which is different from the earlier institutionalism. Therefore, that makes this discussion also interesting. And this new institutionalism is gaining popularity and ground day by day in comparative politics. Of course, once we should remember that new institutionalism is not a highly unified school of thought. There are three different types of schools within new institutionalism. Of course, one is a rational choice school, that there is a cultural institutionalist, and the third institutionalism, and the third is a structural institutionalism. Again, structural institutionalism has two variations, the Marxist structuralism and the liberal structuralism. So therefore, new institutionalism is itself a very broad area for discussion so far as the approach of comparative politics is concerned, which we will be discussing in the next part of our discussion. Now, what I am trying to tell you, that this is what we have to see under modern approaches: behavioral, post-behavioral, system, structural, functional, and neo-institutional. Now, it is interesting to see that how this behavioral revolution, basically that set the entire mood for this modern approach by offering a very trenchant critique of traditional way of doing research and studying comparative politics. So therefore, behavioralism requires in-depth study and discussion. Of course, one thing we should remember, at times you find that in comparative politics behaviorism is also used instead of behavioral. But we should remember that behaviorism as basically intellectual movement started in psychology associated with Watson. But in political science, what we say, this behavioralism in fact started in 1920s that way, one can say, with Charles E. Merriam, particularly his historic presidential speech in American Political Science Association he gave in 1925, and that speech became basically the path, basically a trend setter so far as this behavioral evolution is concerned, when he declared that political behavior should be an object of inquiry for experts and scholars in comparative politics. Of course, at the same time, he also mentioned that when we do research, we should borrow techniques from psychology, economics, anthropology, and other allied and related subjects. And particularly, he also emphasized the special focus we should give on the question of experimentation, statistical analysis, and mathematical modeling. Therefore, he thought that if we do these things, if we operationalize these techniques, then basically, eventually, or basically it will result into a scientific knowledge, and the entire enterprise was meant to produce a scientific knowledge. The quest was make political, research in political science scientific, and therefore this tag science, because which at times becomes very problematic. Because in what way political science is science? This is also discussed both in political science as well as its branches like comparative politics. Because there are two schools of thought, that political science can never become a science like a natural science. because entire the unit of analysis, the main subject for study is human beings, and human beings are basically cannot be turned into inanimate objects like physical, as unit of analysis in physical sciences. And human beings have values. They have basically a number of characteristics which cannot allow those techniques and tools to be applied on studies of their behavior or their sentiments or their sensibility or their motives. So therefore, this kind of entire attempt was critiqued that this science, the quest for making it a scientific enterprise itself is misplaced. So that criticism was offered against behavioralism, and we will see that how post-behavioral revolution accepted this fact that under this spell of scienticism, what we did was basically barefoot empiricism and basically tried to turn it into a kind of positivist subject, positivist positivism of philosophy, where only facts are basically studied, values are totally discarded, and therefore this entire question of relevance came up, that we thought that we were doing great research, but most of those researches and most of the studies were of little significance. So therefore these issues were there, but one thing is very clear, that behavioral revolution started as a protest movement. But before I start discussing this behavioralism, there are 2-3 things I would like to mention, particularly with reference to the difference between traditional and modern approach, particularly behavioral, post-behavioral and traditional, as underlined by a very eminent person, that is Ronald Chilcott. In fact, this issue, that is how 8 intellectual foundation stones of behavioralism were laid by David Easton. I will turn to this issue just in a while, but before that I would like to mention that how Chilcott make a distinction between traditional, behavioral and post-behavioral. For example, Chilcott, who is one of very celebrated author in comparative politics, he says that traditional approach implied both study of both facts and values. It was a prescriptive and normative study. It emphasized qualitative study particularly more than the quantitative. It was non-comparative, of course, but nonetheless it had its own value. It was of course ethnocentric, descriptive, and it focused mostly on formal institutions. Whereas behavioral approach, according to Chilcott's classification, talks about the separation between facts and values, particularly from the point of view of making the research more objective. It emphasizes the use of survey data. It is of course ethnocentric like the traditional, but nonetheless it talks both about formal and informal groups, and therefore in fact these are the characteristics of behavioral. For post-behavioral, according to Chilcott, again like the traditional, they want to tie facts with the values, and therefore the post-behavioralism came as a reaction to behavioralism. This is what I was mentioning, that Easton said that entire world was busy with this behavioral techniques so far as comparative politics is concerned. So many things were happening, but we are cut off from the reality because we simply, in name of separating facts and values, we also discarded this relevance and part of our research. So therefore facts and values are tied, qualitative and quantitative both types of research are emphasized, and then it becomes change oriented rather than status quoist. That was the criticism against the behavioralism, because it didn't talk about any change. It rather, for example, Chalmers Johnson's study of revolution in fact is the best example of this type of approach when it is used to study revolutions. So therefore what happens, that from status quoism to change, this is perhaps the characteristic of post-behavioral thing. So therefore this Chilcott's classification I was telling you. Now coming back to this behavioral approach, that how do we look at this behavioral approach? And here in fact I am reminded of Robert Dahl, very eminent political scientist, who characterized this as a protest movement in political science and in comparative politics. In fact, he felt that when behavior as a unit of analysis was considered important, this was a very important moment so far this movement is concerned, and this entire thing was driven by this quest for science. Of course, this quest for science emerged as a dissatisfaction with the traditional approach, because it was believed that what happened in traditional approach, that only emphasis was laid on institutions, mostly the formal institutions. Therefore, human beings, which are the root of politics, they didn't constitute the focal research, reference point of the political scientists, and therefore, it wanted to take it from formal institutions to human beings and human behavior. So, man and woman became the root of this analysis, and particularly when this behavior was talked about, it was essentially the observable behavior focus of a study, because only observable behavior of human beings can be made amenable to quantitative analysis, or can be made amenable to scientific studies through certain tools which we will discuss later. So, therefore, this was essentially this is what behavioral revolution wanted to achieve through this new movement. Of course, this objective of behavioral revolution, as I was telling you, that Easton talks in terms of 8 intellectual foundations of this behavioral revolutions. Now, these intellectual foundations, 8 intellectual foundations, can tell us that how behavioral revolution tried to achieve this mission of turning the study of comparative politics into pure science. So, therefore, these 8 intellectual foundations are important for all of us to remember and see that what were the limitations and what were the strengths of this new sensibility that is associated with this behavioral revolution. Behavioralism as a revolution set a new mood, a new kind of intellectual environment in political science and in comparative politics, particularly in 40s and 50s, mostly United States of America, and gradually it spread to different parts of the world, where hardly there was any department of political science in any university or any institution which remained untouched with this new intellectual mood that was behavioral evolution. In fact, one scholar has gone to the extent of saying that in United States, most of the scholars located even within department got divided into two camps, the traditionalist and the behavioralist. And this debate became so acrimonious at times that it appeared that entire political science was getting divided into two polar camps. So that was basically the sweep and influence of this behavioral revolution. As I was mentioning about Robert Dahl, that he called it a protest movement, and protest against the traditional way of looking at things, political things. Now, of course, this dissatisfaction with the traditional approach was on account of the fact that it only talked about government and the formal institutions or the state institutions, and therefore the way it looked at the state, it appeared that the state was totally insulated from society, particularly civil society, and therefore it didn't discuss or didn't cover many aspects of people's political lives which needed to be studied and covered within the discussion of in comparative politics. So this was the dissatisfaction. Even the discussion of a state, which is very important theme in political science from ancient times to present day. In fact, the way state was discussed and analyzed was stated that it was discussed in a very narrow sense of the term, particularly in the liberal tradition. We are not discussing about the Marxist tradition, because Marxist tradition or Marxist approach in comparative politics remained untouched with these behavioral or post-behavioral revolutions. We will also take up this Marxist approach later. Now, what is significant to remember, that a state was seen in a narrow sense as totally insulated from civil society, and therefore only the legal constitutional framework of the state made sense for the scholars doing studies in comparative politics. Of course, it is also acknowledged that some very insightful, in-depth country-wide analysis emerged through that traditional approach. For example, the study of Bazhot on, particularly on parliamentary government, or Dicey on rule of law, or basically Jennings on cabinet government. So, all these offered very insightful studies about government, institutions, and so on and so forth, largely within this traditional framework. But nonetheless, what is stated, that a cross-cultural studies, or the study of even politics and government outside this advanced liberal democracies was missing. And particularly, this became more important, particularly after the rise of this Soviet Russia as a communist, political, system, or the Chinese, after the Chinese Revolution of 1949, or perhaps this expansion of this communist regime in Eastern Europe and some other parts of Latin America. So therefore, what happened? A new challenge emerged, that how these systems, could be studied with the approach and the tools which were earlier used only to study advanced liberal democracies of the West, because they were offering altogether different type of, challenges. They are offering different type of political arrangement, or the entire design, the political design was different, the design of institutions, the design of politics. Then another significant factor which also contributed to this sense of limitation, particularly traditional approach, that why it was inadequate, was the rise of fascism and Nazism in Europe, particularly interwar period. It was realized that just by calling them aberration would not help us in developing a better understanding of these systems. So therefore, these two things, the emergence of this communist bloc, particularly Soviet Union and China and many other countries in Latin America and Eastern Europe, along with this anti-colonial movement leading to this freedom of many erstwhile colonies in Latin America, Asia and Africa, known as developing countries, and expansion of this global community through this newly emerged nations mostly as third world countries as they are called, or the developing countries. In fact, this was another challenge, because it was immediately some of these countries, what they did, that they took to, or they basically designed their political system, or they designed their entire institutions on pattern of advanced Western liberal democracies, whereas the situation prevailing in the society was not conducive as per the entire theory which was given by the liberal democratic theory in political science. Therefore, it was a kind of puzzle, a mystery, that first of all, that how it has happened, how they have gone for this entire liberal democratic framework of governance when these objective situations are not conducive for that. Of course, this is also a fact that many of these countries went for this type of model, but they collapsed. Exceptions, of course, most important exception is the case of India. So they offered a challenge that how to explain this new phenomenon which is being witnessed in these countries, and therefore this emergence of communism, emergence of fascism and Nazism, and expansion of this entire global community, particularly with the rise of these newly independent nations as developing countries. These three important developments basically added more weight to this entire feeling about the inadequacy of traditional approach. So therefore, on the one hand, this the contribution of traditional approach was acknowledged so far as this scholarly studies of the Feiner, Frederick, Bagot, Jennings, and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, it was realized that this is the time that we should go for a more expansionist approach instead of that restrictive approach of which was basically used under the spell of traditionalism, and that was totally irrelevant. So therefore, the most important thing was that now a shift was being made from institutions to process, and this is perhaps the hallmark of this modern approach, from institutions to process, and this process which includes man as the root of analysis and observable behavior of human beings as the focus of a study. So therefore, what we find that behavioralism as a revolution basically starts in political science, and particularly in area of comparative politics. Now this behavioralism, particularly the behavioral revolution, we should remember that interestingly what happened that 50s and 60s, one can say the heydays of this behavioral revolution. In USA, of course, it started in 1920s. I mentioned earlier 1925 that famous speech by Charles C. Merriam, particularly the speech he delivered on the American Political Science Association. Now, these are the 8 important, intellectual foundation stone which are basically mentioned and laid by David Easton. They are very significant for understanding, in fact, this entire behavioral evolution. He talks of 8 intellectual foundation stones. The first is regularity, second is verification, third is technique, fourth is quantification, fifth is values, sixth is systematization, seventh is pure science, and eighth is integration. These are the steps through which one can say, or one can say that these are the broad features of this behavioral approach in comparative politics. 8 pronged, one can say, approach, that the purpose is to make it the entire study scientific by following this protocol, the 8 protocol, I would call it. So basically, what are those 8? I'll turn to those issues in a while. But what I am trying to tell you that this entire behavioral revolution interestingly started in United States of America, and it is often mentioned that America had a long tradition of pragmatist philosophy. That's why their contribution or their presence in the normative philosophy is not as visible and as significant as we find from other European parts of Europe. So therefore, they had a tradition of pragmatism, and therefore and a belief in scientific method. So that also contributed for the rise of this behavioral approach in political science in United States of America. What happened that this Chicago, which at times becomes very prominent for number of intellectual movements, In fact, even in economics, at times we hear about Chicago School because of number of initiations which they make in area of social sciences. But here in Chicago, what we find that a very eminent political scientist called Lashwell and his two eminent students, Almond and Truman, they basically took this clue from this entire thing and started doing a very serious, rigorous and sustained study with the help of this new mood which was being set by Charles E. Merriam and others. So therefore, what happened that along with this pragmatist tradition of United States of America, during this war period in Europe, many scholars from Europe also basically took refuge in United States of America, and along with them they took a lot of influences from Europe, like the influence of Weber, as I was mentioning, that particularly the system and structural functionalism which were the fallout of this behavioral revolution. They showed tremendous impact of these anthropologists, be it Radcliffe Brown, Parsons, or Malinowski or Max Weber. And of course, the funding from the Ford and Rockefeller, it is also believed that contributed significantly. So 50s and 60s became the golden period of this behavioral revolution, particularly in comparative politics. In fact, it was of course made possible also by Almond and his colleagues at the American Social Science Research Council when they formed a committee on comparative politics in 1954. And a special attention was given on large scale comparison between different type of political system: democratic, non-democratic, developed, developing, Western, non-Western. So a different type of classificatory framework they basically set before themselves, and therefore formal legal approach, which was hallmark of traditional approach, was totally abandoned. Not totally abandoned, but it was basically underplayed, and now a focus was shifted on processes, not on institutions, and therefore the unit of analysis became political parties, interest group, public opinion, and state as a unit of study was replaced by a new term that is called political system, because it was argued that political system makes more sense than perhaps a state, which is an abstract concept, and political system is more concrete and more realistic representation of political reality. Therefore, political system should replace this entire concept of a state for study in comparative politics. Now, for political system, of course, extra legal, paralegal, and the social institutions were also basically considered important, particularly for studying non-Western political processes, because that was one of the important challenge which was coming before the political scientists who were doing comparative politics in the United States of America, because how to make sense of this non-Western political process, which included country like India, that how democracy is functioning, and even if the objective conditions are not conducive, but still they are surviving, and if they are surviving, then what are the causal factors or the contributory factors through which one can develop a better understanding of these societies. And therefore, it was not only confined to comparative politics in terms of political system, as I was mentioning, that civic culture of Almond and Barba, and system approach of Easton, structural functionalism of Almond and Powell. So all these things were fallout of this entire mood which was set by behavioral revolution. Even on issue of development, the kind of development syndrome which was developed by Lucian Pye, we will have separate discussion on all these issues. Or Walter Rostow, the way he talks of the stages of development, particularly that famous takeoff stage of Rostow. So therefore, in fact, Huntington, another person who has contributed significantly in area of comparative politics when he talked of institutionalization, particularly in terms of his framework of growth and decay. So therefore, what happened that behavioralism set the mood for all these studies in comparative politics, which I have just now underlined, including system, structural functionalism, culture, civic culture, development syndrome, and so on and so forth, along with, of course, the communication theory of Carl Deutsch. So this is how we find that the behavioral revolution made a major headway, particularly in terms of influencing a whole generation of scholars in political science and experts in comparative politics, which basically took clue from this entire mood set by this behavioral school of thought. And therefore, Easton's this 8 intellectual foundation stones become very important. For example, what are those 8 intellectual foundation stones of Easton? That is to be seen more closely. The first is regularity. What is this regularity of Easton? It says that when we do a study or when we do research, we have to see that what are the discernible uniformities in the political behavior. If you do a study, we will find that on a regular basis there is some sort of uniformity emerging in terms of their behavior. So that uniformity has to be seen whether it is occurring on a regular interval or irregular interval. So that regularity can give you some idea about the pattern. And as we know that for systematic study, which is the hallmark of science, deciphering or finding out some pattern is always important, because only basis of that pattern you can make predictions. So therefore, it was argued that regularity is an important feature, and it can be expressed in generalized theories. It can be put in form of larger generalizations, and therefore a hard theory could be built. So theory was not out from this entire discussion. Theory was a very important feature of this revolution, but nonetheless a theory not built on values, but theory built on causal relationship and theory built on facts. So therefore, the entire purpose of finding out regularity was to make predictions of political behavior. And therefore, what happens that the entire study was focusing that how a particular behavior is observable, and whether that behavior is same across time or across space, or there is some difference. If the difference occurs, those differences should also be noted down, and if the similarities occur, the similarities also have to be observed. So therefore, regularity is one aspect. The second aspect is verification. In fact, this verification is equally important. Now, verification means that how certain propositions made during research have to be put to certain empirical test, and without verification, as it is believed that in science it is always argued that no hypothesis can be called valid, or no hypothesis can be considered useful or relevant. So verification, of course there is a debate in philosophy, in political philosophy, in political theory on verification and falsification. For example, a very eminent political philosopher, Karl Popper, argued that it is not verification but falsification which should be the criterion of science, because what we know that all scientific revolutions in the world have not emerged through this route of verification, but it has come out through the process of falsification, that every preceding idea has falsified every succeeding idea has falsified the preceding idea, and this is how a paradigmatic shift in terms of Kuhnian paradigm emerges. So therefore, that is outside the purview of our discussion. What I am trying to highlight here, that this verification is an important component of this entire behavioral thing. The next is technique. That what is technique? Now here, in fact, I should emphasize that technique is a very important component of this behavioral revolution as a modern approach. Now, correct techniques were perhaps always emphasized by the scholars, because if your techniques are wrong, then of course your result is bound to be incorrect. Now, when we talk of techniques, it basically suggests tools and methods, particularly which can be used for collecting reliable comparative data. So how to have that technique? And here they mostly relied on techniques of statistics, and therefore we find that the tools which they operationalized in name of this behavioral research were multivariate analysis, sample survey, mathematical modeling, simulation, etc. and etc. So most of the techniques which were earlier used in science, and particularly those which are called statistical tools and techniques, they were basically borrowed, because it was believed that these techniques could also be used in the study of political behavior, and therefore through these techniques we could achieve scientific results. So therefore, in fact, it was also argued that through by using these techniques we will be able to keep values outside our study and our research, because values in their opinion were the biggest hindrance for making a study scientific and objective, because value preferences would never allow a more objective finding or more objective study. Of course, this aspect was criticized by many scholars, saying that this entire quest for science took them to techniques and methods which were totally unsuitable for political science, because they should have realized that they were studying human beings as a unit of analysis, and these techniques are not suitable to understand values, motives, sentiments, feelings of human beings. And therefore, in fact, by using these techniques, they were simply wasting their time. And some of the things which came up during this post-behavioral revolution, particularly in terms of that credo of relevance speech of Easton also. The third was quantification. This is equally important. Now, this quantification, fourth is the quantification, and quantification means measurement or quantifying data. Now, of course, it was argued that imprecise qualitative judgment should be replaced with vigorous measurement and data manipulation through the techniques which I have already highlighted, those statistical techniques. And therefore, it was believed that if we take to this route, if we quantify data and basically keep the qualitative aspect of this research outside the outside our concern and consideration, then perhaps more accurate knowledge could emerge. So therefore, this quantification of data was another hallmark of this behavioral revolution. Then next was, of course, this also met with a lot of criticism. It was believed that the data, the size and amount of data is so large, particularly in political science and comparative politics, that quantification was simply impossible. This entire attempt was misplaced, and therefore the kind of data which we deal with sometimes are unreliable data, and therefore this kind of data which is to be made amenable to these quantitative techniques were totally erroneous. Now the next is the values, and this is perhaps very important thing, because that was the basis for this entire this revolution, because it was believed that earlier studies were value loaded, and therefore value judgments were passed, preferences were expressed, and in studies of comparative politics, and therefore no scientific analysis could develop, or it could not be considered scientific by other scientific communities, be natural science or other areas of social sciences. So therefore, value neutrality was the hallmark of this entire behavioral revolution. The ethical evaluative principles were replaced by empirical explanation. It was believed that only empirical findings, empirical arguments, and only those hypotheses which could be validated through empirical data and empirical research could be considered worthwhile in comparative politics. So therefore, in fact, it was believed that the facts and values should be kept analytically separate and different. They may be studied separately, but they cannot be mixed while doing any study. So therefore, values, even if someone is interested in doing a study of certain political values, but that should not be brought into the research where you are dealing with facts. So therefore, value-free study was promoted, and moral and ethical questions were put aside, and this perhaps became highly problematic. And therefore, when this post-behavioral revolution emerged, it was argued that so many things happened in the world during that period when people, scholars were under a spell of behavioral revolution, but they were totally cut off from those things because they simply did a kind of empirical studies which didn't make much sense for political science or the politics of the people. The next is systematization, and this tells you about theory orientation, that how theory is to be built. Because of course they didn't discard theory, but rather they wanted theory which is basically oriented towards causal analysis, the cause-effect relationship, which is basically the main feature of scientific theories. Instead of interpretative and value-loaded theories, they wanted causal theories, and therefore only those theories where the hypotheses could be accurately tested they were not speculative, they were targeting those theories. Of course, they were also targeting big theories, grand theories, but nonetheless causal oriented, cause effect model based theory. And the next was the pure science, because they wanted to make it a pure science by replicating the methods of natural science as well as many other allied social sciences who were already doing such things like anthropology, psychology, economics, and so on and so forth. And finally, this integration, which is also a very important thing, that is interdisciplinary study, because it was believed that what was done in comparative politics earlier was totally cut off from other sister subjects or allied branches of social science. So interdisciplinarity was another hallmark of this entire thing, and it was done through integration. Now, these were the 8 intellectual foundations of behavioralism. Of course, criticisms came from different quarters, but most important criticisms, of course, were offered by those who were earlier using traditional approach in comparative politics. But the most trenchant criticism came from a person who was at one point of time was basically the flag bearer of behavioral evolution. That was David Easton. And this is what we know as Credo of relevance of David Easton, particularly when he talked about 7 factors that how this behavioral evolution made entire enterprise of research in comparative politics totally irrelevant. And in 7, of course, as an intellectual foundation, he talked of 8 features, but as a credo of relevance, that is basically the hallmark of post-behavioral mood, which he set. In fact, he underlined 7 important features of this post-behavioral evolution. First of all, he highlighted that how substance should come before technique, because it is more important that meaningful research should be conducted. It is not that techniques should be or methods should be fetishized, and therefore he argued that post-behavioralists the credo of, the slogan he gave, that is better to be vague than non-relevant, because the behavioralists believe that it is better to be wrong than vague, which he turned upside down and said it is better to be vague than non-relevant, because he thought that what was being done under spell of behavioralism was totally irrelevant. He talked about social change, not social preservation, that is status quoism, which behavioralism promoted. He also talked that the scholarship should not be cut off from the brute reality of politics, which behavioralism led to. When a lot of things were happening in the world, they were not in a position to explain them. And then restoration of values, in fact, to rightful place was another aspect. And then the responsibility we have to discharge as a sensible person in intellectual community, where our responsibility is towards society and people, and we cannot basically afford to do a research which is totally irrelevant for society. And then he talked of action science, that how political science or comparative politics should action oriented. So this credo of relevance speech of David Easton, particularly in that 1969 speech, was a very significant moment for comparative politics so far as this modern approach is concerned. And then after we find that we move towards different directions. So therefore, this system, structural functionalism and other thing which came out of this, we will discuss in our next part.
With this note, thank you, sir. Thank you so very much. Dear friends, do write to us at info.cec@nic.in if you have any queries, or if you want to give your feedback for this particular lecture. We would be meeting again very soon. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, sir. Thank you once again.